Hello and welcome back to our channel. Where are you and what time is it as you're listening to this story? After you finish listening, please leave a comment and share your feedback down below. One was the heir to one of the most ancient and powerful castles in England. The other was a billionaire possessing the most colossal fortune in Europe. In the 18th century, the forbidden gay romance between William Courtenay and William Beckford was not merely a scandal. It was a capital offense carrying the death penalty. Hunted by the aristocracy, stripped of their identities by their own families, and forced into a brutal exile, their love story was buried by history for over 200 years. The answer is buried deep within the suffocating social and legal architecture of 18th century England. Georgian society was defined by a ruthless dichotomy. The aristocracy cultivated an atmosphere of Enlightenment thinking, hoarding vast wealth, commissioning grand works of art, and building sprawling estates, yet the legal code they enforced was brutally draconian. The Buggery Act of 1533, originally enacted under King Henry VIII, remained the unyielding law of the land. Under this statute, any intimate relationship between two men was classified not merely as a moral failing, but as a capital felony. The state and the church operated in tandem to police the private lives of citizens. Discovery guaranteed complete social and political annihilation, and the courts frequently handed down the ultimate punishment of death by hanging. The stakes for deviation were absolute. Survival required a flawless public facade, a rigid adherence to the established norms of marriage, inheritance, and aristocratic duty. There was no margin for error, and no amount of wealth or title could offer absolute immunity once a formal accusation was leveled. The epicenter of this impending collision was Powderham Castle in Devon, a formidable structure built between 1390 and 1410 by Sir William Courtenay. Powderham was not merely a residence. It was a fortress of aristocratic expectation and a symbol of one of England's most ancient lineages. The Courtenay family possessed a continuous line of ownership spanning over 6 centuries, rooting their power deep in the soil of Devon. The castle's sweeping estates, fortified walls, and medieval towers stood as physical manifestations of the family's enduring political and social dominance. The weight of this massive legacy fell entirely upon the shoulders of one child. Born on July 30, 1768, William Courtenay, known exclusively to his intimates as Kitty, was the sole male heir in a generation of 13 sisters. From the moment he drew his first breath, his life was not his own. The entire future of the Courtenay dynasty, the preservation of their titles, and the management of their sprawling estates depended on his survival and his adherence to the rigid script written for him by his ancestors. Kitty possessed a striking physical presence that only intensified the relentless scrutiny placed upon him. He was widely recognized as the most beautiful youth in England, a status that transformed him into an object of intense public and artistic fascination. The most celebrated portraitists of the era sought to capture his likeness, viewing his flawless features as the pinnacle of aristocratic refinement. Joshua Reynolds painted him at the ages of 10 and 23, meticulously documenting his transition from a sheltered child to a burdened heir. Richard Causeway produced numerous works highlighting the boy's delicate beauty. Yet, this intense attention was isolating. Kitty was sheltered within the vast expanse of Powderham, surrounded by a phalanx of sisters and tutors, raised with the explicit understanding that his primary function was to secure a politically advantageous marriage and produce the next generation of Courtenay heirs. His emotional needs were entirely secondary to the survival of the dynasty. Into this rigid, ancient world of old blood entered a figure of immense, newly acquired power. William Beckford, born in 1760, was an anomaly of Georgian society. His wealth did not stem from centuries of English feudal land ownership, but from the brutal, highly lucrative machinery of the British Empire. He inherited a staggering fortune of £1 million from his father, Alderman William Beckford, which came under his full control when he reached his majority in 1781. This inheritance, translating to over £200 million in modern currency, was generated entirely by a vast network of sugar plantations in Jamaica, sustained by the labor of enslaved people. This immense influx of colonial wealth made Beckford one of the richest men in Europe, granting him a level of financial independence that rivaled kings. However, his new money also made him an object of suspicion among the established, landed aristocracy, forcing him to constantly prove his refinement and cultural worth. Beckford's intellect was sharp, eccentric, and heavily cultivated by the leading minds of the age. His education was a relentless pursuit of the extraordinary. He received early musical instruction from an 8-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, studied the rigorous principles of classical architecture under Sir William Chambers, and delved into the complexities of Oriental languages with the poet Samuel Henley. He possessed a restless, brilliant mind that would eventually channel its vast, eclectic knowledge into the creation of the renowned Gothic novel Vathek. Yet, his vast resources and intellectual brilliance offered no protection against his own nature. His distinct emotional and physical preference for men was a poorly kept secret among the elite. Whispers of his inclinations circulated through the drawing rooms of London, placing him under constant, crushing pressure from his family. They demanded he secure a high-profile marriage to neutralize the rumors, sanitize his reputation, and secure his political future in the House of Commons. When the 21-year-old Beckford arrived at Powderham Castle in July 1781 and met the 13-year-old Kitty, the collision of their worlds was immediate and profound. Beckford found himself instantly captivated by the boy. Kitty represented a stark contrast to the calculating, cynical world of London society that Beckford despised. He viewed the young heir not merely as a beautiful youth, but as a sanctuary, an untouched mind he could shape, and a soul capable of genuine, uncalculated affection. Beckford initiated a relentless, obsessive correspondence. He poured his intense fixations into letters that abandoned all conventional restraint, addressing the young heir with explicit tenderness and utilizing intimate monikers like Cupid and Sweet C. These letters were dangerous documents, physical evidence of a capital crime, yet Beckford's arrogance and passion overrode his caution. They carved out a hidden existence within the ancient walls of the castle. They retreated frequently to a private designated space in the medieval Tower of Powderham, isolating themselves from the watchful eyes of the servants and the suffocating presence of Kitty's family. For a time, they successfully navigated the lethal environment of their era, building an intense emotional and physical bond in absolute secrecy. The medieval tower became an island of dangerous freedom in a sea of rigid societal expectations. However, the external pressures of Georgian society were relentless. The rumors surrounding Beckford's sexuality grew louder and more specific, threatening to derail his political ambitions and bring ruin to his family name. By May 1783, the walls closed in. Beckford was cornered by his family and forced into a marriage with Lady Margaret Gordon. The union was a calculated political maneuver, a convenient, desperately needed shield designed specifically to blind the public and provide Beckford with the conventional facade demanded of a gentleman of his station. Margaret was a pawn in an elaborate game of survival, providing Beckford with the necessary cover to continue his life without facing the gallows or permanent exile. But the marriage was a hollow contract that did nothing to sever the profound bond between Beckford and Kitty. Despite the immense risks, their clandestine relationship continued unabated. They maintained their correspondence and their secret meetings, engaging in a dangerous defiance of the very laws Beckford's marriage was meant to appease. They were operating on borrowed time, slowly building the foundation for a catastrophic collision that would systematically destroy the lives they had so carefully constructed. The illusion of safety constructed by William Beckford's arranged marriage held for precisely 1 year. Lady Margaret Gordon fulfilled her assigned role perfectly, providing the necessary aristocratic veneer and quickly falling pregnant, seemingly confirming Beckford's adherence to the expected Georgian domestic model. But this domestic tranquility was a brittle facade, masking the continued dangerous reality of his relationship with Kitty Courtenay. The immense wealth Beckford possessed fostered a fatal arrogance. He believed his money and his newly acquired marital status rendered him untouchable, effectively placing him above the draconian laws that governed lesser men. This arrogance bred carelessness, and that carelessness culminated in the catastrophic events of June 1784. The Courtenay family hosted a grand midsummer gathering at Powderham Castle, a traditional display of wealth and social cohesion. Beckford, accompanied by his pregnant wife, arrived as an honored guest. They were given quarters in the castle's medieval tower, the very location that had previously served as a sanctuary for Beckford and the young heir. The guest list for this midsummer gathering included a man who would become the architect of their mutual destruction, Alexander Wedderburn, Lord Loughborough. Loughborough was Kitty's uncle by marriage, having wed the sister of the 8th Earl of Devon. He was not a man driven by sentiment or family loyalty. He was a political shark, a ruthless and deeply ambitious Scottish lawyer who had climbed the treacherous ranks of British politics to become a prominent judge and politician. Loughborough viewed the world entirely through the lens of leverage and power. The Courtenay dynasty, with its vast estates and ancient name, was a vital asset in his political portfolio. Any threat to the Courtenay reputation was a direct threat to his own standing. Loughborough was already deeply suspicious of the eccentric, newly wealthy Beckford, viewing him as a volatile and undesirable influence. The precise sequence of events that unfolded in the dimly lit corridors of the medieval tower remains obscured by centuries of deliberate obfuscation, but the undeniable catalyst was a piece of paper. In a moment of inexplicable negligence, a highly compromising letter written by Beckford fell into Loughborough's hands. The contents were unmistakable and devastating. Beckford had abandoned the coded language often used to mask illicit affairs. He wrote with explicit intimacy, utilizing male pronouns to describe his profound physical and emotional bond with Kitty. There was no room for misinterpretation. The letter was a stark confession of a capital felony, rendered in undeniable ink. For a man like Loughborough, this document was not a tragedy. It was a weapon. The discovery of the letter ignited a chain reaction of violence and panic within the castle. The hushed decorum of the aristocratic gathering shattered. Historical records and the terrified whispers of the castle's staff paint a picture of sudden, intense chaos erupting in the guest quarters. Rumors circulated rapidly among the servants, and soon the broader public, that a violent physical altercation had taken place. Accounts suggested that a guest, drawn by the commotion, had forced entry into a bedroom and discovered Beckford in the act of whipping Kitty. Whether this was a moment of sadomasochistic intimacy violently interrupted, or a brutal argument born of panic and exposure, the result was the same. The undeniable reality of their relationship was suddenly dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light. Loughborough seized total control of the situation with brutal efficiency. There was no hesitation, no attempt at quiet mediation. He confronted Beckford directly, armed with the damning letter and the eyewitness accounts of the castle staff. The confrontation was swift and absolute. Beckford, stripped of his arrogance and facing the immediate threat of the gallows, had no defense. By the time the sun rose the following morning, Beckford was unceremoniously expelled from Powderham Castle. His bags were packed in frantic haste, carried down the stone steps by the valet Robert Ralph, and he was driven from the estate in total disgrace. The physical expulsion, however, was merely the beginning. Kitty Courtenay, newly turned 16, was left behind in the ruins. He was instantly isolated, trapped within the walls of his own home, and subjected to the furious interrogation of his family. The 8th Earl of Devon, Kitty's father, was a man ill-equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude. The shock of the revelation and the impending ruin of his ancient house paralyzed him. He deferred entirely to Loughborough. This decision sealed the fate of both Kitty and Beckford. A different family might have chosen to close ranks, burning the letter and burying the scandal to protect the dynasty at all costs. But Loughborough saw an opportunity to permanently eliminate Beckford from the political and social landscape, while simultaneously framing the young Kitty purely as an innocent, albeit compromised, victim of a predatory older man. To achieve this, Loughborough made the calculated decision to detonate the scandal publicly. He waited until October 1784 to strike. Georgian London possessed a ruthless, highly effective media apparatus, and Loughborough knew exactly how to weaponize it. He deliberately leaked the details of the Powderham incident to the most prominent and aggressive newspapers of the day, including the Morning Herald and the Morning Post. To circumvent direct libel laws while ensuring maximum destructive impact, the press employed vicious satire. They did not outright accuse Beckford of buggery, a move that would have forced a criminal trial and implicated the Courtenay family directly. Instead, they attacked him with relentless, mocking innuendo. The scandal was famously dubbed the grammar mistake of Mr. B. The newspapers gleefully dissected Beckford's supposed inability to distinguish between the pronouns he and she, turning a potential death sentence into a grotesque national punchline. The written attacks were rapidly followed by a devastating visual assault. The late 18th century was the golden age of British caricature, and the artists of London descended upon the scandal with merciless enthusiasm. James Gilray, the most prominent satirist of the era, produced a series of brutal engravings that plastered Beckford's image across the city. These prints stripped Beckford of his dignity, portraying him as a monstrous, effeminate deviant. The caricatures were displayed in shop windows and passed around coffee houses, ensuring that the scandal reached every layer of society, including the illiterate masses. The destruction was absolute and instantaneous. Within a matter of weeks, William Beckford went from being one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the British Empire to a social pariah, actively hunted by the press and despised by the public. The trap had sprung, leaving both men facing a bleak, terrifying new reality. The immense fortune that had bred William Beckford's fatal arrogance now served as his sole barricade against the executioner. In the chaotic aftermath of the October 1784 press assault, the legal realities of Georgian England came into sharp, terrifying focus. The Buggery Act of 1533 demanded strict criteria for a conviction, typically requiring the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses to the physical act itself. Lord Loughborough possessed a highly incriminating letter and the circumstantial accounts of terrified servants, which were more than sufficient to orchestrate a public lynching in the press, but legally precarious for a formal prosecution. Furthermore, bringing Beckford to trial would necessitate dragging Kitty Courtenay into an open courtroom. Subjecting the heir of Powderham to cross-examination would permanently dismantle the Courtenay dynasty, transforming a public embarrassment into total institutional ruin. Loughborough desired Beckford's absolute destruction, not the annihilation of his own family's political leverage. A silent, brutal compromise was forged in the shadows of the elite. Beckford would leave the country immediately, stripping himself of his political ambitions and social standing. In exchange, the state would not file criminal charges. He traded his country for his life. In the spring of 1785, Beckford fled across the English Channel. This was not the celebrated grand tour expected of a wealthy gentleman, but a frantic, humiliating retreat. He sought refuge in Switzerland, settling near the shores of Lake Geneva. The stark, imposing alpine landscape provided a harsh contrast to the lush, manicured estates he had abandoned. He was accompanied into this bleak exile by his wife, Lady Margaret. Her position was uniquely tragic. She was a casualty of the Georgian marriage market, a woman wedded to a man solely to provide a respectable veneer for his hidden life. Yet, despite the extreme public humiliation and the total destruction of her own social standing by association, she remained beside him. Her loyalty was a quiet defiance against the society that had exiled them, but it exacted a fatal toll. Margaret's health deteriorated in the foreign climate, exacerbated by the relentless stress of their isolation. In May 1786, shortly after giving birth to their second daughter, she succumbed to severe postpartum complications. She was 24 years old. Her death severed Beckford's last tether to conventional society. He was left stranded in a foreign land, entirely isolated, possessing millions of pounds but fundamentally hollowed out by grief and scandal. While Beckford navigated the cold reality of Swiss exile, the destruction visited upon Kitty Courtenay was executed behind the heavy oak doors of his own home. At 16, he was legally a minor, physically trapped within the vast acreage of Powderham Castle. The estate, once his inheritance, transformed instantly into a high-security prison. Lord Loughborough assumed total, dictatorial control over the boy's existence. Kitty was systematically removed from any remaining social circles. He was denied the customary rites of passage for an aristocratic youth. There would be no education at Oxford, no season in London, and absolutely no prospects for an advantageous marriage. He was placed under strict surveillance, moved between remote family properties, and kept hidden from the public eye as if he were a contagion. He was a prisoner of his own bloodline, forced to absorb the unyielding anger and shame of his family on a daily basis. The psychological weight of the scandal proved lethal to the older generation. The 8th Earl of Devon, Kitty's father, possessed a fragile constitution that entirely collapsed under the public disgrace. He was a man who had dedicated his life to maintaining the unblemished prestige of the Courtenay name. Watch that name become the grotesque punchline of London broadsheets and tavern jokes broke his mind. The shame materialized as a physical affliction. He descended into a severe, paralyzing depression, shutting himself away in the darkened rooms of the castle. He refused visitors, neglected the management of his estates, and deteriorated rapidly. In 1788, just 4 years after the incident in the medieval tower, the 8th Earl died. His death was a direct casualty of the scandal, a life extinguished by the sheer force of societal condemnation. At the age of 20, Kitty Courtenay inherited the titles and the ruins. The earldom of Devon was considered dormant at this time, resting on complex legal precedents that would not be resolved for decades, so he officially assumed the title of the 3rd Viscount Courtenay. He was now the absolute master of Powderham Castle. He commanded an immense fortune, vast tracts of land across Devon, and held authority over hundreds of tenants and servants. He possessed everything Georgian society dictated a man required for total supremacy, yet he was entirely powerless. He was a wealthy ghost haunting his own ancestral halls. The contradiction of his existence was absolute. He held the highest rank in his county, but no respectable family would receive him, and no gentleman of equal standing would ride through his gates. Determined to survive the suffocating isolation, the young Viscount attempted to construct a world within a world. If Georgian society would not grant him entry, he would use his massive wealth to build a society of his own behind the walls of Powderham. Between 1788 and 1810, he engaged in a relentless campaign of architectural and cultural patronage. He poured tens of thousands of pounds into the beautification of the castle. He commissioned James Wyatt, the most fashionable architect of the era, to design a magnificent music room. This space was a masterpiece of Regency design, featuring towering ceilings, exquisite plasterwork, and vast windows overlooking the River Exe. It was built specifically to host grand entertainments, a defiant physical statement that the master of Powderham was not dead. He filled the castle with art, purchasing lavish furnishings and expanding the grounds. He threw extravagant parties, offering the finest wines and the most elaborate music. But the reality of his isolation could not be masked by gold leaf and orchestras. The guests who attended these gatherings were not the elite peers of the realm. They were opportunists, hangers-on, minor gentry, and individuals willing to overlook a ruined reputation in exchange for free patronage and proximity to extreme wealth. He was constantly surrounded by people, yet profoundly and dangerously alone. Every smile directed at him was bought. Every conversation was shadowed by the unspoken reality of the 1784 scandal. He lived in a state of suspended animation, aging within his gilded cage, carrying the constant, grinding anxiety that the past he was desperately trying to outspend was merely lying dormant, waiting for a second chance to destroy him completely. While William Courtenay fought a losing battle to purchase respectability within the walls of Powderham Castle, William Beckford engaged in a radically different strategy of survival. After 11 years of wandering the European continent, Beckford returned to England in 1796. He was 36 years old, hardened by grief, and still in possession of an astronomical fortune. His return was not a rehabilitation. The British aristocracy possesses a long memory, and the scandal of 1784 remained firmly attached to his name. The doors of polite society remained securely locked against him. He was a man without a country in his own homeland. Recognizing the absolute finality of his social excommunication, Beckford made a calculated, extraordinary decision. If he could not rejoin English society, he would build a fortress to permanently exclude it. He retreated to his family's massive estate in Wiltshire, a vast expanse of land far removed from the critical eyes of London. There, he initiated one of the most obsessive, megalomaniacal construction projects in British architectural history. He ordered the demolition of the existing classical mansion built by his father and commissioned the architect James Wyatt to design a structure that would physically manifest his immense wealth, his towering intellect, and his profound alienation. The result was Fonthill Abbey. It was not designed to be a home. It was a colossal architectural act of defiance. Constructed in the Gothic Revival style, the abbey was conceived on a scale designed to dwarf the surrounding landscape and intimidate anyone who approached it. The construction of Fonthill Abbey consumed Beckford's life and fortune for the next 2 decades. The logistics of the project were staggering. At times, 500 laborers worked continuously in day and night shifts. When Beckford demanded faster progress, he drafted local villagers and conscripted workers from the construction of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, bribing them with higher wages and unlimited rations of ale. He commanded the building of a formidable barrier, a wall 12 feet high and 7 miles long, completely enclosing the estate. This wall was topped with iron spikes and patrolled by armed guards and vicious dogs. Beckford explicitly stated the wall was built to keep out the hunting hounds of the local gentry, but its true purpose was unmistakable. It was a physical enforcement of his exile, a barricade separating the ruined genius from the society that had ruined him. The centerpiece of Fonthill Abbey was an octagonal, central tower that soared to a height of nearly 300 feet. From this immense vantage point, Beckford could look down upon the English countryside, physically elevated above the peers who despised him. Inside the abbey, he curated a collection of art, rare books, and antiquities that rivaled the inventories of European monarchs. He filled the cavernous, vaulted halls with treasures acquired during his exile. Renaissance paintings, solid gold chalices, intricate Japanese lacquers, and entire libraries of rare manuscripts. He lived entirely alone within this vast, echoing museum. He ate his meals in a dining room large enough to host a royal banquet, served by a small army of staff who were strictly forbidden from speaking to him unless spoken to first. He had successfully created an impregnable, self-contained universe, fueled by the relentless profits of Jamaican sugar and guarded by stone and iron. Yet, the architectural triumph of Fonthill Abbey carried a fatal flaw, mirroring the doomed trajectory of its owner. Beckford's impatience and demand for immediate results forced the builders to cut critical structural corners. The massive central tower, the crowning symbol of his defiance, was erected hastily. The foundations were disastrously inadequate for the immense weight of the stone and timber above. The tower was fundamentally unstable from the moment it was completed. It stood as a towering, magnificent facade resting on compromised ground, a perfect physical metaphor for the precarious, isolated existence of the two men whose lives were shattered in 1784. 200 miles away, within the increasingly suffocating confines of Powderham Castle, William Courtenay was approaching a total psychological collapse. By 1810, Kitty was 42 years old. The strategy of outspending his past had definitively failed. The extravagant parties, the massive architectural additions, the endless patronage, none of it had restored his standing. The local gentry continued to shun him, and the national elite treated him as an untouchable pariah. The decades of enforced isolation, combined with the relentless, grinding anxiety of potential legal action, had severely eroded his mental stability. The gilded cage he had constructed was rusting, and the walls were closing in. The internal torment of the Viscount culminated in the creation of a remarkable, tragic document in 1810. Driven by an overwhelming need to articulate the injustice of his lifelong punishment, Kitty drafted a private memorandum. This was not a legal brief intended for a court of law. It was a desperate psychological defense mechanism, a man pleading his case to an empty room. In this document, Kitty confronted the events of 1784 directly. He painstakingly documented the exact chronology of his relationship with Beckford, specifically highlighting a crucial, undeniable fact that society had entirely ignored: his age. He wrote with bitter clarity that when the affair began, he was merely a child of 13, deeply under the influence of a charismatic wealthy man, 8 years his senior. The memorandum is a profound historical artifact. It strips away the aristocratic titles and the vast wealth, revealing a deeply traumatized individual desperately attempting to reassign the blame that had destroyed his life. Kitty argued that he was the victim of a predatory dynamic, corrupted before he possessed the capacity to understand the legal or moral consequences of his actions. He expressed a profound, agonizing bewilderment that a mistake made in early adolescence had resulted in a permanent, irrevocable sentence of social death. Yet, despite the emotional weight and logical clarity of the document, Kitty knew the Georgian public would never accept it. The memorandum was a secret confession, locked away in a desk drawer at Powderham, serving only as a silent testament to the devastating psychological toll of his prolonged exile. The fragile equilibrium Kitty had maintained at Powderham shattered completely in the spring of 1811. The exact catalyst for the renewed crisis remains heavily debated by historians, but the outcome was swift and brutal. New allegations regarding his private life surfaced in London. Whether these accusations were based on new indiscretions or simply a targeted resurrection of the 1784 scandal by political enemies remains unclear. The Georgian legal system was highly susceptible to manipulation by those holding vendettas. An accusation did not require immediate evidence to initiate a catastrophic sequence of events. The mere filing of a formal complaint was enough to trigger an arrest warrant under the Buggery Act. The threat was no longer abstract. It was immediate and lethal. Warrants were drawn up, and the local magistrates, perhaps pressured by political figures in London, prepared to move against the Viscount. The agonizing memory of his father's death and the total destruction of his youth paralyzed him. Kitty knew that if he was arrested and brought to trial, the Courtenay dynasty would be subjected to a public autopsy far worse than the events of 1784. The trial would not merely end his life. It would permanently extinguish the honor of a family that had survived the Wars of the Roses and the English Civil War. He had to make an immediate, impossible choice: face a rigged, highly prejudiced legal system and the distinct possibility of the gallows, or abandon the ancestral seat his family had held for over 4 centuries. He chose flight. The departure was chaotic and desperate. There was no time for careful packing or orderly delegation of estate management. Kitty Courtenay, the 3rd Viscount Courtenay, and the de facto 9th Earl of Devon, gathered whatever liquid assets and portable wealth he could carry and fled Powderham Castle under the cover of darkness. He traveled rapidly to the coast, securing passage on a ship bound for the United States. As the vessel pulled away from the English shoreline, Kitty watched the country that had defined, elevated, and ultimately destroyed him fade into the horizon. He was 43 years old, stripped of his lands, his societal rank, and his home. Lord Loughborough's vicious campaign of annihilation, initiated 27 years prior, had finally achieved its ultimate objective. The Master of Powderham was officially a fugitive. The Atlantic crossing of 1811 was not a voyage of discovery. It was a desperate physical severing of a man from his absolute center of gravity. For 43 years, William Courtenay's entire identity had been inextricably bound to the soil of Devon, the stone walls of Powderham, and the rigid hierarchy of the British peerage. As the American shoreline materialized through the fog, he was forced to confront a terrifying reality. He was stepping onto foreign soil not as an aristocrat conducting a leisurely tour, but as a wealthy fugitive, a man whose existence in his homeland had been officially classified as a criminal contagion. He sought refuge in the young American Republic, settling on a sprawling estate known as Claremont, located in what is now the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Manhattan. The geography offered a cruel irony. The estate provided sweeping, majestic views of the Hudson River, a landscape that eerily mirrored the deep tidal estuary of the River Exe that flowed past the gates of Powderham Castle. Courtenay attempted to transplant the only life he understood into this alien environment. He utilized the substantial funds he had managed to extract before his flight to maintain a lavish household, purchasing fine horses, hosting local dignitaries, and attempting to construct a localized aristocracy in a nation that had recently fought a brutal war to eradicate the very concept of inherited nobility. Yet, this flawless institutional cover-up encountered fierce, silent resistance from the most unlikely demographic, the castle staff. The Georgian aristocracy viewed their servants as invisible, mechanical extensions of the estate, assuming they shared the family's priority of maintaining the bloodline's unblemished reputation. They were fundamentally wrong. The men and women who cleaned the grates and served the meals at Powderham possessed an acute, unvarnished understanding of the truth, and they chose to protect the exiled heir. This silent mutiny began with Robert Ralph, the valet, who had been stationed in the medieval tower on the night of the 1784 Midsummer Scandal. Ralph had witnessed the violence, the panic, and the subsequent expulsion of William Beckford. He had packed Beckford's bags and escorted him off the premises. The London press, hungry for first-hand accounts to fuel their satirical fires, would have paid a fortune for his testimony. Lord Loughborough would have ruthlessly interrogated him, but Ralph locked his jaw. He maintained absolute silence regarding the events of that night, protecting the teenage Kitty from further ruin, and took the precise details of the scandal to his grave when he died in 1812. The resistance was not limited to silence. It took the form of physical, daily defiance. Edward Bullock, the fiercely loyal butler of Powderham, refused to accept the family's decree that Kitty was effectively dead. For 20 years following Kitty's panic flight to America in 1811, Bullock maintained his master's private chambers in the medieval tower in a state of suspended readiness. While the rest of the family actively avoided the rooms associated with the scandal, Bullock ordered the chambermaids to keep the space immaculate. The heavy curtains were drawn back, the bed linens were turned down every evening, and the fireplace was kept perpetually stoked, It was a daily, physical protest against the family's narrative of erasure. Bullock was demanding that the castle remember the man the family was desperately trying to forget. He maintained this vigil until his own death, keeping a fire burning for a master who was an ocean away and legally barred from ever returning. While the staff at Powderham kept his memory alive, Kitty's physical reality in France was deteriorating. The isolation was absolute. The vibrant, beautiful youth captured by Reynolds had hardened into a deeply solitary man in his 60s. He lived a severely constricted life, heavily dependent on the quarterly allowance grudgingly authorized by the family lawyers in London. He moved from Draveil to a modest residence in Paris, stripping away the remaining trappings of his aristocratic status. In 1831, a bizarre and deeply cynical legal victory was achieved in London. After years of aggressive petitioning by the Courtenay family lawyers, the British House of Lords formally resolved the complex legal precedents surrounding the family's dormant titles. The Earldom of Devon, one of the oldest and most prestigious titles in the English peerage, was officially resurrected and restored to the Courtenay line. Because William Courtenay was the eldest living male heir, the state had no choice but to legally recognize him. The man who had been hunted by the magistrates, publicly destroyed by the press, and forced to flee the country under the threat of execution was officially proclaimed the 9th Earl of Devon. This restoration was entirely bureaucratic. It offered no redemption, no pardon, and no apology. The British establishment recognized his bloodline while continuing to criminalize his existence. He was an earl in name only, permanently confined to his Parisian exile, strictly forbidden from taking his seat in the House of Lords or setting foot on English soil. The title was a hollow categorization that did nothing to alter the brutal reality of his daily life. He was a peer of the realm dying in a foreign boarding house. The physical toll of his lifelong anxiety and isolation finally broke him in the spring of 1835. On May 14, at the age of 66, William Courtenay, the 9th Earl of Devon, died of pneumonia in Paris. There was no state funeral, no public mourning, and no acknowledgement from the British Crown he legally served. His death was handled with the same cold efficiency that had characterized his family's treatment of him in life. His body was prepared in France and quietly shipped across the English Channel. The Courtenay family, terrified that a public burial might resurrect the scandal they had spent 50 years suppressing, orchestrated a clandestine return. The coffin was brought to Powderham Castle under the cover of darkness. He was interred in the family crypt without fanfare, slipped into the stone vault alongside the ancestors whose legacy had crushed him. The family sealed the tomb, firmly believing that they had finally, permanently buried the shame of 1784. The man was dead, the press had forgotten him, and the official history was secure. They assumed the truth had been interred with the corpse. The Courtenay family, satisfied that the final traces of the 9th Earl had been eradicated in the flames, moved forward with the ruthless efficiency characteristic of the British peerage. The official history was sealed. The portrait of William Courtenay, painted by Joshua Reynolds, remained hanging on the walls, but the subject was stripped of his humanity. He was reduced to a minor, eccentric footnote in the grand lineage, an earl who suffered from an overly delicate constitution and preferred the climate of France to the responsibilities of Devon. The brutal reality of his persecution, his terror, and his agonizing isolation was entirely surgically removed from the family record. The cabinet in the medieval tower began a long, unbroken sleep. For 145 years, the letters sat in total darkness while the world outside the stone walls underwent violent, total transformation. The Victorian era, with its rigid moral absolutes and suffocating prudery, reached its zenith and collapsed. The British Empire expanded to cover a quarter of the globe and then slowly fractured. The 20th century arrived, bringing mechanized slaughter on a scale previously incomprehensible. Through the devastating attrition of the First World War and the relentless aerial bombardments of the Second World War, Powderham Castle stood firm. The Courtenay dynasty, like the rest of the British aristocracy, sustained heavy casualties and severe economic blows. The era of limitless wealth and total domestic supremacy came to an end. Massive death duties and sweeping societal changes forced the great houses of England to adapt or face ruin. Powderham Castle was forced to open its gates. To generate the capital necessary for its survival, the fortress of the Courtenays was transformed into a heritage destination. Tourists purchased tickets to walk through the staterooms, admiring the James Wyatt architecture, the intricate plasterwork of the music room, and the extensive art collection. Professional guides memorized scripts detailing the heroism of the Courtenay knights during the Wars of the Roses and the political maneuvering of the earls under the Tudor monarchs. Millions of people passed through the corridors over the decades, completely unaware that they were walking just yards away from a radioactive historical secret. The family themselves remained entirely oblivious. Generations of earls and viscounts lived, married, and died in the castle, passing the heavy oak cabinet in the medieval tower without a second glance, trusting the sanitized history their ancestors had so carefully engineered. The silence was profound, demonstrating the incredible violence of archival erasure. When a family controls the documents, they control the truth. By suppressing Kitty's letters, the 19th century Courtenays had successfully murdered him a second time, stripping him of his right to defend himself, to articulate his suffering, and to exist as a three-dimensional human being. The tragedy of the ninth Earl was buried so deeply that even his own bloodline had forgotten the coordinates of the grave. The cabinet held the volatile truth, waiting for a generation equipped with the emotional capacity to confront it. The dust settled thicker over the wood, the ink on the letters continued to age, and the ghost of the exiled earl remained trapped in the tower, silenced by the shame of his family, waiting for an exoneration that seemed mathematically impossible. The turn of the 21st century brought a radically different cultural landscape. The brutal laws that had mandated the destruction of Kitty and Beckford had been systematically dismantled. The capital punishments of the Georgian era and the chemical castrations of the mid-20th century were replaced by a slow, hard-fought march toward legal equality and social acceptance. Yet inside the walls of Powderham, the narrative remained frozen in the Victorian era. The guidebooks still peddled the story of the sensitive, melancholic earl. The truth required an external catalyst, a disruption of the ancient, unquestioned routines of the estate. The heavy iron key to the cabinet in the medieval tower had been lost to time, but the structural integrity of the seal was finally beginning to weaken, setting the stage for a collision between a carefully curated lie and the undeniable handwritten reality of a destroyed man. The physical breach of the cabinet occurred in the winter of 2017. An estate archivist, conducting a routine inventory of the castle's oldest remaining furniture, encountered the locked oak doors in the medieval tower. The iron key was long gone, forcing a careful mechanical intervention to break the 145-year-old seal. As the doors finally swung open, the air inside the chamber was instantly filled with the dry, sharp scent of aged paper and dried ink. The archivist did not find forgotten estate ledgers or dusty financial records. Resting in the dark were thick, meticulously tied bundles of correspondence. A brief examination of the handwriting and the dates confirmed the impossible. Margaret Lacy's silent rebellion had survived. The lost archive of William Courtenay, the exiled 9th Earl of Devon, had been brought back into the light. The discovery was immediately escalated to the current master of the estate, Charles Courtenay, the 19th Earl of Devon, and his wife, the American actress A.J. Langer. They carried the heavy bundles out of the medieval tower and down into the vast, imposing expanse of the marble hall. Sitting beneath the soaring vaulted ceilings, and the stern portraits of their ancestors, they began to read. As they untied the ribbons and carefully unfolded the brittle parchment, the sanitized institutional history of their family collapsed completely. The letters were a devastating catalog of human suffering. They read the frantic, intercepted dispatches sent from the Claremont estate in New York, describing the utter isolation of a man trapped in a hostile republic. They read the agonizing pleas dispatched from the chateau in Dravale, written by an aging, lonely exile begging for a fraction of his legal inheritance just to survive the Parisian winter. They saw the undeniable evidence of the systematic cruelty engineered by their own predecessors. The letters stripped away the aristocratic veneer of the sensitive, melancholic earl and exposed the brutal reality. The Courtenay family had actively destroyed their own son just to protect their political power. Confronted with the undeniable handwritten proof of this historical trauma, Charles Courtenay and A.J. Langer faced a monumental decision. The aristocratic instinct, honed over centuries of survival, dictated a swift return to the shadows. The easiest, most conventional path was to simply place the letters back into the archives, lock the door, and allow the profitable, uncontroversial narrative of the guidebook to continue undisturbed. Revealing the truth meant voluntarily dragging the Courtenay name back into the center of a scandal, admitting to generations of institutional deceit, and fundamentally altering the public identity of Powderham Castle. They rejected the instinct to hide. In a profound departure from the rigid, defensive posture of the British peerage, the modern Courtenay family chose radical, absolute transparency. They recognized that continuing to suppress the letters was an act of complicity in the original crime. The 19th Earl made the decision to formally dismantle the lie that had protected his family for over 2 centuries and vindicate the ancestor they had destroyed. The execution of this decision was deliberate and public. In 2019, the official Powderham Castle guidebook was completely rewritten. The vague, sanitized paragraphs detailing the 9th Earl's prolonged European travels were struck from the record entirely. The new publication explicitly detailed the events of the 1784 Midsummer Party. It named William Beckford. It named Lord Loughborough as the architect of the smear campaign. Most importantly, it acknowledged the devastating reality of Kitty's lifelong exile and the family's active role in his erasure. The family did not offer excuses or attempt to contextualize the cruelty as a product of its time. They presented the unvarnished facts and allowed the tragedy to speak for itself. The physical manifestation of this reconciliation took place in the Marble Hall. The Courtenays commissioned a specialized, climate-controlled glass display case. They took the very letters that Margaret Lacy had risked everything to save from the fire and placed them inside, positioning the display in the center of the castle's most magnificent room. The letters were no longer hidden in a dark tower. They were elevated to the status of sacred relics. Today, when thousands of visitors walk through the heavy oak doors of Powderham, they do not merely see a monument to medieval architecture or Tudor politics. They are immediately confronted with the fragile, yellowed evidence of a destroyed life, displayed with absolute reverence by the descendants of the people who inflicted the destruction. The paradox of Powderham Castle stands as a profound testament to the fragile nature of recorded history and the enduring power of empathy. A man who was hunted by the press, legally designated a capital felon, and subject to a lifetime of agonizing, solitary exile is now the most honored figure within his ancestral home. William Courtenay's name is no longer whispered in shame. It is spoken with fierce pride, elevating him from a tragic victim to a vibrant, enduring symbol of the LGBTQ+ community. This transformation reveals a critical truth about the mechanics of historical memory. History is not a fixed, immovable monolith dictated solely by the victors or the oppressors. It is a living, malleable entity, entirely dependent on who controls the archives and who possesses the courage to reinterpret them. The draconian laws of Georgian England and the ruthless media campaigns of Lord Loughborough succeeded in destroying Kitty Courtenay's physical life, but they failed to secure his permanent erasure because a single, nameless housekeeper decided that the truth was more valuable than her own safety. The vindication of the ninth Earl demands that we look beyond the grand, sanitized narratives of power and wealth. It forces us to search for the hidden casualties, the individuals crushed beneath the machinery of societal expectation. The story of William Courtenay and William Beckford is a stark reminder of the lethal consequences of prejudice, illustrating how rapidly a society will turn upon its own to enforce a rigid, unnatural conformity. Yet, the final chapter of this narrative offers a profound moral counterweight. It proves that the cruelties of the past do not have the final word. When met with the courage to face uncomfortable truths and the empathy to recognize the humanity in the marginalized, even the darkest, most carefully guarded legacies of shame can be dismantled, allowing the victims of history to finally come home.